Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you're at across the country today. And welcome to the Transition Accelerators webinar, Building Indigenous Economic Participation into Canada's Future, What's Working and What's Not. My name's Jane McDonald. I'm the VP of Climate and Nature Solutions, as well as a proud member of the Transition Accelerators Board, and I'll be your moderator today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. The Transition Accelerator, with staff from Victoria to Halifax, recognizes and respects the ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have to the land and is committed to the ongoing process of reconciliation. Before we get started, we do have a few exciting events coming up that we'd like to preview, and I'm hoping that you can see some information about these in the chat as well. First of all, please, a shout out for everyone to join us on June 25th, 26th in Ottawa for Canada's Net Zero Forum 2025. It's our second annual forum, and last year's was a huge success. It runs for 2 days. It's great strategic networking, some really bold conversations on securing our competitive future. So please do join us on June 25th and 26th. Secondly, we run courses at the Transition Accelerator on energy modeling for non-modelers, so 99.9% of us, and on strategic pathways to net zero. And these are all designed to put the latest understanding of the energy transition in your hands. So again, please take advantage of those. You'll see some details in the chat. And finally, our next webinar is on March 11th, and it will be a co-presentation with Electrifying Canada and Toronto Hydro. And it's exploring the challenges and opportunities for scaling electricity systems affordably. And now let's get started with today's conversation. We're excited to have such a diverse audience join us from across Canada for this discussion. And we're going to be talking about how some of Canada's biggest utilities are building, approving, and practicing Indigenous equity partnership and ownership models. Today we'll have some intro remarks and then a panel discussion. And we will take audience questions at the end. So please do submit yours in the Q&A box. And before we get to our panel, I'm going to kick us off with some welcoming remarks by introducing you to Patrick Tomlinson. He's the Indigenous Relations Project Manager at BC Hydro. And he's going to give us some opening remarks on what's happening right now at BC Hydro with their approach and all the interesting things that they're up to. So Patrick, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. May I first say that BC Hydro acknowledges that our infrastructure and operations exist on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples throughout British Columbia, and we're grateful to carry out our work on these lands. And we recognize and respect the interests of all Indigenous peoples, their distinct cultures, histories, laws, and governments. Thank you, Jane, and to the Transition Accelerator for organizing this timely discussion. And may I say it's a genuine pleasure to appear alongside Hydro One, First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and Indigenous Clean Energy, three organizations who, each in their own way, have pioneered models of support for Indigenous nations as they quest towards achieving self-government and self-determination. In a moment, I'll highlight a couple of examples of how BC Hydro is working collaboratively with BC First Nations to achieve clean energy goals while also providing meaningful opportunities for First Nations to benefit economically from BC Hydro projects and work. First, I'd just like to quickly note a few things about BC Hydro and the Indigenous working environment in BC. As some of you may know, BC Hydro is unique amongst today's guests in that we're a government-owned utility. And because of our Crown Corporation status, BC Hydro interacts with the provincial government quite regularly. We take important direction from the government, for example, when a mandate letter is issued to us by the Minister of Energy. It's also worth noting that we are a vertically integrated utility and we have a large service area. BC Hydro oversees and manages all facets of the BC electricity system in nearly all parts of the province. And when thinking about Indigenous nations in BC, it's important to note a few things as well. There are over 200 First Nations with acknowledged traditional territories in BC. And additionally, only a few areas of the province are covered by modern or historic treaties. So BC Hydro often works on land that is defined as unceded territory with overlapping claims. Finally, it's worth noting that in 2019, the provincial government passed the DRIPA Act, which confirmed that the provincial government will use UNDRIP as the framework for Indigenous reconciliation. DRIPA really has been a game changer, and I'd say that in a good way, DRIPA has created some uncertainty and disruption for everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people alike, because it's brought about a long overdue emphasis towards co-development of new and better ways of working together. So all these factors affect how BC Hydro thinks about what meaningful participation and economic reconciliation can look like in the context of our business. For example, following the passage of DRIPA, we worked collaboratively with First Nations to develop an UNDRIP implementation plan, and we established a UN Declaration Advisory Committee that consists of 6 prominent First Nations leaders who will monitor our progress in achieving the plan's objectives. Some of the most exciting opportunities in our implementation plan, and the ones that I'm most familiar with, are found in the economic relations section. And most of my work over the past 2.5 years has been to support my executives' efforts to actualize new business models that put First Nations economic interests more front and center at all stages of a project's life cycle. Currently, I'm working on the team at BC Hydro that's negotiating a possible First Nations co-ownership agreement on a proposed 450-kilometer transmission line in the northwest region of the province. This is a complex project, partly because it's being delivered in 2 phases, and so will likely involve 2 sets of agreements, but also because there are more than a dozen First Nations whose territories are touched by the proposed line. Because we're in the throes of negotiation, I can't say much more, but I can say that the various types of skill sets and knowledge needed to properly think through and plan all the stages of a corporate partnership and a project life cycle that will likely last more than 50 years is very large. As such, both human and financial capacity are critical inputs and can be critical challenges for all sides when trying to implement a successful Indigenous co-ownership model. A second relevant initiative that I've worked on that I can speak more about is BC Hydro's Call for Power. On that project, I had the privilege of working with First Nations across the province to design a First Nations economic participation model. Critically, when the call was first announced, BC Hydro resisted the urge to unilaterally develop a design of the procurement rules. Instead, we organized a series of workshops and meetings with First Nations to discuss how the procurement could be designed so as to maximize the economic opportunities for them. The final design of the model consisted of a First Nations equity eligibility requirement and several project evaluation credits tied to the proposal's ability to show economic partnerships with First Nations. The design was widely accepted by First Nations, and it turned out to produce some impressive results. Not only did we ultimately buy more than 50% more power than we had originally announced, First Nations ended up owning majority stakes in 8 of the 9 winning projects. Over the course of our province-wide engagement on the call, we met with representatives of 99 First Nations, and we also had the benefit of regular feedback from important and knowledgeable advocacy groups like Major Projects Coalition and ICE. As you can imagine, we were presented with a wide variety of views, and sometimes they were contradictory. For example, though we heard from many First Nations that equity ownership should be insisted on in our model, there was a number of First Nations who didn't think equity should be prioritized. They were worried that such a prioritization would alienate less advanced First Nations from participating. There was also considerable debate over the level of First Nations equity that should be required. Many First Nations argued that for a lower threshold, again, because they felt like a higher threshold might be less obtainable and even less beneficial for First Nations, particularly those whose balance sheets are not so robust or who lack diversification in their asset portfolios. Others vehemently argued the opposite. BC Hydro should insist that First Nations be majority owners of every project that wins a contract. So these examples show that there's no sort of one dominant opinion, even amongst First Nations, for the right way to do these kinds of projects. These examples give a brief introduction into some of our recent experiences as we work to repair and strengthen our relationships with First Nations. I think BC Hydro has made some important progress to advance reconciliation, and I know that my executive understands that more work is needed, and they're genuinely committed to doing more. As many people here know today, this is complex work. From BC Hydro's perspective, part of the complexity comes from two ever-present tensions. First, as a public utility who provides an essential service to the province, we're expected to prioritize the interests of the ratepayers and to assure the electricity grid operates reliably and safely. The interests of First Nations, as important as they are, need to be balanced against these other interests. Second, as a Crown corporation, BC Hydro has an important role to play in advancing Indigenous self-determination and self-government, and we're uniquely situated to contribute to this work. That said, we must be careful not to overfunction, and it's important for Indigenous allies and advocates to understand the limits to what we're capable of doing. Sometimes we get confronted with expectations that are just not within our mandate or ability to advance. In many important respects, BC Hydro is a policy taker, not a policy maker when it comes to Indigenous reconciliation, and this includes economic reconciliation. That said, we're genuinely committed to incorporating the principles of the UN Declaration into our business, and we understand that change will require us to be open to new ways of doing business that put First Nations more front and center in our business processes and decisions. Thanks very much, Jane. I look forward to hearing from the others.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for those remarks and for that window into how BC Hydro is thinking through all this. Really interesting, and we'll look forward to you joining us again at the end for audience questions. Thanks a lot. All right, now let's turn to our panelists. Penny Favel, VP Indigenous Relations and Sustainability at Hydro One. Saga Williams, Senior Advisor at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and Chris Henderson, Founding Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy. Welcome to you all. Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Thanks, Jane.
There's a long pause there. I thought I was having technical. Hi,
We're
everyone.
here. Hi.
I wonder if I'm going to throw maybe same question to each of you just to kick us all off, since you're coming at this question from different seats. Maybe since this focus of today's webinar is Indigenous equity participation, you could just start by talking a little bit about what does equity mean to you and your organization. And I wonder, Saga, why don't we start with you?
Great, thanks. First, I want to acknowledge the territory that I am speaking to you today. I am in Lac-Seul First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe community in northwestern Ontario. It's the homelands of my mother's people, and very honored to be able to participate in this webinar from her homelands. And I think coming back to your question, Jane, and coming from the perspective of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which speaks to creating the space for equity ownership for our members, and equity ownership looking at $100 million or more in terms of their share of major projects. So I think creating the space for that type of ownership and projects is something that we are mandated to do from our members, which we have 170 members across the country. It's, I think to Chris's point, is a diverse range of perspectives when it comes to the opportunities that First Nations across this country have in the energy sector. I think what we need to do is help the capacity of communities to be able to take up the opportunities that exist in their traditional territory. And from our perspective, any development that happens in Canada is happening on the lands of Indigenous peoples. And particularly from our perspective, we're representing First Nation communities. And so we talk to and inform our communities about those opportunities and support those opportunities. I think I can leave it at that, but I think what our real mandate is about showcasing where those opportunities lie and supporting communities' participation when working with utilities, when working with government officials about what a framework for economic participation looks like.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saga. Chris, can I throw it to you? You're next on my screen here.
Sure, Jane. I'm joining you from unceded Anishinaabe lands here in the Ottawa Valley. At the heart of it, equity ownership means you have decision-making rights. It's a reflection of rights of First Nations, sovereign rights, And when you have equity ownership, you're at the table. You're at the table to decide if the project should happen. You're there at the table to decide when it should happen, in what way it should happen, how it should be designed. And you're there to design how, in fact, and share the decisions on how it is moving forward in terms of how it'll be financed, how it will be provide benefits. And in this way, when you have equity, you are affirming reciprocity. You are affirming the equality of reconciliation that has to happen as we develop natural resources in the country and clean energy in particular. That, to me, is the heart of the way we express equity.
Right. Thank you so much. Penny, do you want to add anything from your perspective at Hydro One?
Sure, I would love to. I always like to acknowledge that Toronto is in the homeland of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Not a lot of acknowledgement about Treaty 13 was one of the most important ones, particularly for Canada. So I want to talk about Hydro One is Ontario based. So our approach to equity is actually led by the Ontario First Nations that we have been dealing with across the country. The context in Ontario is that equity was always a requirement historically to have in transmission lines. The problem was that there wasn't a really good set of parameters about what the equity should look like. And I think Chris makes a good point about what equity means. So when I got to Hydro One about 4 years ago, one of the first things we talked about is, well, what do the First Nations want? What are they saying? And we heard resoundingly at the table that they wanted to be true partnerships. The chiefs pointed us to the treaties. They said we were partners under the treaties. This is the orientation you should bring to equity when it comes to making money off of these transmission assets. So to put it in context, Hydro One is a publicly traded company, but we are highly regulated by the OEB. So the OEB mandates us to carry the construction debt on our projects, and 40% of the project's value is what's called the equity portion. And that's the portion where you can earn a return. Now that 40% is generally going to get a return of between 9 and 10%, which is a pretty decent return. So we were pretty excited by the opportunity to say to First Nations, when we're at the table with you, we're not going to start the conversation by saying, well, how little equity would you take? How about starting the conversation by saying, let's get that out of the way. We've actually heard you, and we're going to go forward in partnership, and we're going to actually figure out how to partner in a way that allows you to make the critical decisions that you want to make and participate and have input, but doesn't expose you to construction overrun risk or regulatory uncertainty. And because we finance these big transmission lines basically on our balance sheet, we have a certain amount of flexibility that allows us, given our footprint, to say every single time the line is over $100 million, we're going to share equity 50-50. So it's unique, I think, to Hydro One in the sense that nobody else in the industry is doing this, but also given our footprint in Ontario. That's how we approached equity. And again, the way I approach Indigenous relations and engagement generally is it has to be community-led. If a project comes in or a company comes in and they say, oh, we have a great solution for you, I virtually guarantee you're going to fail.
Right. Thank you so much. Second, I wonder, I'm just going to maybe ask you a specific question to lead us into this discussion. You have a background in law, and I'm sure that gives you some specific insights through the work you're doing into the financial and investment barriers facing many Indigenous communities. And can you just talk a little bit about how these barriers changed or diminished in your time working with communities?
Well, I think the evolution goes much further than my time here on the planet. I know from my own experiences with being a member of Curve Lake First Nation and not being one of the very few communities in Canada where we had no constitutionally protected rights until 2018, despite signing a post-Confederation and many pre-Confederation treaties, that the challenges and barriers that we faced in terms of participating in the economy around us and the development around us was very challenged. There was Indian Act barriers that existed around us being able to leverage reserve land in order to create a system of accessing capital. We have the the Major Projects Coalition has worked to eliminate that barrier in terms of the National Loan Guarantee Program and working on affordable access to capital for our communities. I would say that the evolution of legal principles in terms of the duty to consult, accommodate, have allowed communities to be able to have the conversations that where I think Penny's talking about in terms of what are their unique needs and how do we utilize our rights, our constitutionally protected rights, to be able to pivot to the conversations where equity ownership is possible. I think having a organization like the coalition constantly work to eliminate those barriers so that the conversations for community members can happen and create the frameworks where equity ownership in project development becomes the norm and becomes the platform from which these conversations take place is really important and allows us to achieve economic reconciliation. So, I mean, the historical barriers are vast and they come in the form of economic suppression, which is why economic reconciliation and making initiatives and empowering communities and building their capacity is so important in terms of allowing them to have these conversations. And whether it's equity ownership in the transmission to mining mining activities that take place so that a number of communities can benefit from major projects development as opposed to it being site specific. And I think that's one of the unique opportunities that the energy sector allows for communities to work together in achieving their own goals and creating the framework that allows them to do that.
Thanks. Chris, I wonder, having gone through so many projects yourself with through ICE, you've said that Indigenous communities can leverage equity in sort of different ways. I think I have 3 different ways, maybe carried interest, partner capital provision, and public capital. Do you want to talk a little bit about the differences between these 3 approaches and how you've seen that kind of leveraging of equity work well across projects?
Yeah, let's keep an eye on metrics for a minute, Jane. So you have about 300 medium to large renewable energy projects that are co-owned or owned by Indigenous communities and about 3,000 smaller projects.
Yep.
So when you're financing those projects, first of all, you want to maximize the ownership shares, but also the terms of capital. So with ICE, and we support First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, all 3 designations. And so first you want to go with carried interest, which gets to the point that Saika has mentioned, that there's an inherent right because you're using Indigenous land, so that creates some interest you gain in equity without capital investment. Secondly, you look at private capital investment that comes from partners. The more capable companies in the sector understand that they can come to the table and also help through their own balance sheets and through the senior debt financing from lenders to help communities also gain equity and backstop some of the capital equity that they need. And finally, you have the leverage of public financing, which could be grants, it could be sovereign debt guarantees, and it could be sovereign debt at lower costs. All 3 are relevant. And in fact, the more you leverage all 3, the higher the gains are. But I will come back to a question I hope you'll ask me later, which is, what does equity really mean? Because the devil is in the details. So we should talk about the devil as we go along here.
Well, go ahead and tell me about the devil in the details.
Because it all depends on terms. It all depends. So at the end of the day, if someone says, well, I've got 50% interest or 25% interest, 50% interest can mean almost nothing if the terms aren't there. So who makes the decisions? What requirement of capital is needed to operate the project? What's the performance of the project? When does capital received in terms of return? How does it mean? What does it mean in terms of procurement rights? What does it mean for employment rights? So, one of the things that we really strive to do with Indigenous clean energy in our programming is help equip Indigenous communities to have the know-how to negotiate the terms. So the 2 messages I would give very strongly here is, one, maximize capital by leveraging all forms of capital, public, carried interest, and private capital. And laterally, also look to see how the terms are configured so that you know what benefits are being received and you're trying to maximize those benefits. Both those things go together.
And which of those is hardest to kind of nail down? And where do you have challenges? Or do you think
On the capital side?
Yeah.
I would say the toughest one would be very much looking at how the private capital would come in, because I mean, depending on what the capacity is of the partners, if you're dealing with the utility directly or you're dealing with a private developer, there are different scale of flexibility that they have, and sometimes you're stretching them. I mean, I won't reveal the meeting I had this morning, but it was definitely stretching a private developer to go further than they would normally have gone. So it's a negotiation process. And so there's a reconciliation reality, but there's also a negotiation process of business. And I would say that there's been a very real receptivity on public capital. That might change though. I mean, governments change and therefore the terms of public capital changes. But carried interest, I found by and large, there's an acceptance that there should be some carried interest in projects. Private capital depends on how you negotiate that with partners.
Fair enough. Penny, do you have any views from your seat on how these other types of sort of conditions around the equity come into play and how you've been dealing with those at Hydro One?
Yeah, happy to. So in terms of risk and benefits under the agreements, I think it's a really good point to underscore that the devil really is in the details. And so Hydro One's really transparent about what we do. We carry fully the entire project until energization. That's fully carried by us. It's on our balance sheets. We take on all of the debts. When the project is close to energization, like it's almost to be switched on, that's when the money will start to flow to Indigenous communities, assuming that they take the opportunity to invest in the equity offering. So they haven't been exposed to construction overrun risk or dilution. They haven't been exposed to regulatory risk because in Ontario, the Ontario Energy Board has to approve our cost of capital. So if you build a big transmission line, the Ontario Energy Board can, and certainly does, with an eye on prudency, say, well, some of those costs are disallowed. So Hydro One takes the risk of those. Some of our biggest projects, we've been very open about the focus on procurement as well as the table stake stuff, which is, in my view, education training. But the procurements have been, the commitments we've made on the Waasigan project have been 30% procurement. That's huge. Nobody else is doing 30% procurement or talking about it. So the devil really is in the details, and we're pretty proud of the details that we spin out. The other piece, though, I guess, if I'm thinking about it, is it's really important to understand that Hydro One doesn't hold Indigenous communities out of having important input into decisions just because they don't activate their equity investment until the end. Communities, not just because there's a regulatory and a constitutional imperative to engage, we are engaging because you engage with Indigenous communities on linear infrastructure because it makes the project better. If you have 10 Indigenous communities and you're trying to cite what is the most ideal linear infrastructure project, let me tell you, you're going to get really good advice, not just on the environmental assessment, but all over from the Indigenous communities that you're working with. So we start on that basis, but then there will be areas where the Indigenous communities definitely want to have a say, and that will also be in areas like, let's talk about who's going to build this project in terms of the EPC. So those pieces, we're not perfect. We would never say we are. We're working and learning as we go along. But those are the key, details that we put a lot of time and thought into. And I do want to say on the financing side, I do want to give credit to the hard work that First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and in particular, the late Nilo Edwards did. He and I were in Ottawa together, several meetings, and he was tireless, and we owe a debt to him, and I'm certainly going to miss him in the space. But yes, that was the critical piece. Is what Indigenous communities were finding is, yes, if you want to fund the entire project, there's definitely money out there at competitive rates. Problem, you just want to fund this equity opportunity that's going to spin off a 9 or 10% return. That's where the lenders were having cold feet.
Penny, while I have you, and just thinking about kind of where you've landed at Hydro One, it might be interesting for people to hear from you, sort of, how did this model get built? Rewind a little from where you sort of landed to how this all got started internally. Was it something the board was pushing? Were there individuals within the company, or or without, or was it just a general education on the fact of what you're talking about in terms of just projects are better if there are Indigenous involvement? I mean,
I don't
to
want
be
to say all of the above, but
yeah, well, it'd just be
I'll-
interesting to know, because not everybody is where
is where we are. Yeah.
there you are.
Super happy. Yeah. So in Ontario, again, the context, think about the context. Ontario's sort of for the last, I want to say at least 15 years, Ontario has always said there should be an equity component in transmission lines. And remember, we're just talking about transmission lines in our equity model. There should be an equity component. The problem was there was never really any great guidance around what it should be. And so you spent a lot of time negotiating, should it be 20%, 10, 5? So that's the basis. The second foundational thing is every single piece of transmission infrastructure is on someone's traditional territory. And I think when you put those two things together, then really we were, as I've said, we were led at the table by the chiefs that we were negotiating with. And was it one or two chiefs? No, it was resoundingly. And the other piece of context for Ontario is the size of our transmission grid in Ontario is going to double in the next 10 years. Okay, so there's never going to be an opportunity like this. So there were those imperatives that were sort of driving this forward. We started with the chiefs, and we started because I come from a construction background. I'm a construction lawyer by training. I know not just how expensive delay can be, but how great a commercial advantage it can be to have an Indigenous partnership, a First Nations partnership behind you when you're building. And we had an exceptionally receptive board, an exceptionally receptive ELT, and we were able to show real commercial value in this proposition to our shareholders.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Chris, I wonder, I mean, at ICE, you've been working to accelerate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis participation. Sorry, I didn't make that clear first time around, in Canadian clean energy projects. But how's participation opportunities in clean energy projects laid out differently than in traditional energy projects like oil and gas?
I mean, one of the advantages of clean energy projects is they have a long duration term with some certainty once they're constructed. And that makes a big difference. So therefore, we actually have a saying that, clean energy is a way to get rich slowly. Because once you built it, you know what it's earning. And because its rates are locked in, financing is locked in. So therefore, it stands uniquely in a way to leverage equity in a way so that benefits Indigenous communities. But what I would say also is that we're getting more diversity now as we're moving in the energy transition. So we've talked mostly about generation projects on renewable energy, and we talked transmission. But now we're dealing with storage project. We're dealing with heating and cooling projects. Yesterday I was dealing with a district energy project. So it's becoming more diverse, and therefore the models of how equity is going to be financed, how equity is going to generate return, the capacity of communities to be in that space, even large-scale energy efficiency in housing is a huge economic opportunity that has a major return. So I think we're in an evolving stage that in fact mirrors the energy transition in terms of where Indigenous communities will be. But I would say this, is that while the opportunities are there, we have to realize that public policy has a really important say with this. I applaud those governments that have said we're going to go into that direction. But as we move through energy transition, we're going to need new models of financing, new models of relationship and partnership, because the nature of energy projects are changing quite dramatically. But generically, they lend themselves to long-term partnerships that are stable, that are generative, and that are positive.
Thinking about kind of moving forward, what makes a good sort of energy project? Saga, maybe you could help us out in terms of, you talked a little bit about obviously sort of capacity and engagement being so key in communities in terms of making these things work. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what's working and what's not in this space? About tools like frameworks or community investment funds? How are those driving sort of strong engagement and participation, or what more could we be doing?
So great question. And I think given the feedback that we've gotten from our members, one of the things that they talked about was exactly that they needed the capacity to understand the opportunities that the energy sector provided and how they could participate in the process to gain equity shares in projects that were developing around them. There's a big push to look at what clean energy looks like in different areas. And part of us building the capacity of our members and those communities across the country, quite frankly, is we developed a report working with an Indigenous consulting firm, Akwate, to publish the National Indigenous Electrification Strategy to talk about what those points of intersection could be, what were the importance of participating in this sector in terms of identifying those opportunities, what were some of the barriers that were identified by our members, and then what are the solutions that we could support our members working in this sector. So that's about 100-page report that goes extensively into this subject and will provide a really good framework for communities to be able to use as a resource in order to pick that up and say, okay, well, let's see what's happening across the country. Let's see what the successes have been, the wise practices, the best practices, and build from there. And I think Penny mentioned participation in environmental assessment processes and impact assessment processes. And we've worked really hard to build the capacity of our members in terms of participating in those processes. We know not every community is right now going to have an opportunity to participate in a major project that where their equity share is going to be over $100 million. But what we do know is that there's a number of opportunities that continually come knocking on their door. And in order for them to take up these opportunities, their metrics, as Chris identified, is evaluating, does this make sense for us from an environmental perspective? First and foremost, our values lie in who we are as Indigenous people, as Anishinaabe people, and is this something that we can support given our responsibilities to look at 7 generations ahead and look at those guiding principles in terms of, are we going to leave an environment for those future generations that is better than the one that we were born into? And we've created those frameworks. We have the Spirit of the Land Toolkit that we've worked with a number of communities across this country to pilot and to allow them to not only participate in those environmental assessment processes, but also lead those environmental assessment processes, which has helped to speed up the regulatory approvals that are needed. And I think time is of the essence. We know that we're all working towards a environment where the less impacts that we have from a carbon footprint is going to be what drives us to move forward in terms of supporting clean energy projects and our participation in that area.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to note that I think we have put your electrification strategy in the chat. I really encourage everybody to check that out. It's a great document with tons of info in it. So if you haven't seen it already, you can link to it in our chat. All right, I'm conscious of time here and I want to get to audience questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if we can get Patrick back into the mix. If he's still on, and I wait for people to just finish any last minute questions they have. We're going to do something called the game show round with all of our panelists here today. I'm just going to ask you some true or false questions. There will be absolutely 0 cash prizes at the end of this, just bragging rights. So, so hopefully I can get everybody energized before we move into Q&As. But I'm going to start just asking quick questions to each of you. And I'm going to start with Chris. There you are. I see you now. Hi, Chris. True or false, Chris? Indigenous equity investments in wind power top those in hydropower?
Yes, true.
Okay, well, the answer is it's false, because as of the latest data we have in actually in SAGA's report, based on some Fasken research, Indigenous investments in hydropower slightly edge out those in wind, 31% versus
It's
30%.
whether you look at all assets or new assets. That's the issue. I
I
always
was
go with
gonna
all
say, but
assets.
I'm asking the wrong guy because you're going to know.
It's all assets because you're looking at the vast majority of hydropower was built well before the last 2 decades, and
That is
those
true.
did not have Indigenous partnership. But wind power has happened in the last 20 years. That's why wind power has higher equity ownership relatively to all assets of clean energy.
Relative to all assets that exist now.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, it's a good qualifier. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give it to you. All right, moving to the next question. Can I ask this of you, Saga? The first Indigenous-owned wind farm in Canada is located in British Columbia. True or false?
False.
That's right, it is false. For extra bonus points, do you know where it is?
Can I say Ontario, just given the Green Energy Act?
You could, but you'd be wrong because it's located in Quebec. It's the Reduce and Wind Farm, which is a partnership between the Mi'kmaq communities and Interjects.
Yep.
Okay,
Wow.
Penny, you got to save us here. There we go. True or false, Penny? Over 20% of Indigenous communities in Canada are involved in renewable energy projects.
I would say true.
That is true. That is true. And that's according to, I'm using ICE research here, but it looks like their beneficiaries almost 20% of Canadians' electricity generating infrastructure. So that's kind of exciting and hopefully growing quickly. And last, but definitely not least, Patrick, good to have you back. I'm going to give you a softie and just mainly a test of whether you were listening to other panelists here. In 2024, the government launched a $5 billion loan guarantee program to facilitate more Indigenous ownership energy deals. True or false?
I know I don't know if the specifics are all true, but I know they definitely launched it. And my understanding is it was up to 20 billion actually. But so anyway, yes.
It is true. It is true. It was announced at FNMPC's annual conference last year. So we'll give you the deep details, but you're right. It is true. So way to go. Way to go, everybody. Okay. I'm going to now turn to some questions from the audience. Let me see if I can just pull them up here. Okay. Here's a good one. What metrics define good equity partnership? Percent of investment capital required, return on investment, voting share, employment, procurement, etc. I think we've kind of said that a mix of these is sort of required to say good, but does anybody want to comment specifically on metrics?
To me, it begins with decision making. If major decisions of the project are made with Indigenous partners at the table, regardless of the equity percentage, that to me is the sine qua non, which you have to have. At the end of the day, then you're looking at market rates of return. But in terms of the benefits that flow to communities, I think Penny's point about construction, employment benefits add to the equity benefits. In some cases, they actually outstrip the equity benefits in terms of the net benefit to the communities.
Here. Great. I'm going to move to the next question. What is the general level? I'll maybe throw this to Saga or Chris. What is the general level of support and enthusiasm among Indigenous communities for utility scale clean energy power plants on their land? What are some of the most common issues communities have with agreeing to participate in these projects? Saga, do you want to start?
Well, maybe I can start. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for looking at the opportunities that exist. I think that communities' capacity to take up those opportunities is a big challenge. And I think that's where, organizations like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition comes into play in terms of sharing successes of other communities in terms of occupying this space. And to Chris's point, like creating those aspects of what partnership looks like so the community can get the right mix of what their own particular participation. I don't think that there's hard and fast rules in terms of this is the template that's going to work for everybody. I think that given a community's own circumstances, other projects that might be important to them and other opportunities that they're working on obviously factor into their decision and their ability to take up all of the opportunities that exist. But I think that when we can showcase the successes of communities who occupy this space and what aspects of the deal that have been successful and make sense to their community is where other communities can see themselves participating also in this space and then providing the necessary supports that they need to bring their community along. And we've talked about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I think a really important aspect to that is free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to a community's participation, and ensuring that all community members are brought along in the in a decision-making process that allows them to have that informed consent as part of their participation.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'd add to
Yes, go ahead.
Saga's points that there's both small and large projects. I mean,
Mhm.
large projects have big impact, but many communities want to do small projects, community scale projects, or even small generation projects or storage projects. So both are relevant. Communities want to go there. The tough love message I give to communities and ICE supports with communities is that you got to do the hard work. If you really want to be, if you may be enthusiastic is the starting point. The question is then, what is your capability to make enthusiasm reality? And so therefore, it's intensive work that happens over years. It doesn't happen over a few months or one negotiation or a few meetings or one information session with the community. It happens over years. And so the real challenge is translating enthusiasm to the reality of the hard work of doing both small and large scale clean energy projects.
Right. I have a couple more practical questions here I'd love to just get people's take on. Do you have an indication for how long Indigenous equity ownership is maintained over the life of an energy generation project? For example, is the equity expected to be sold off within 5 years, 10 years, never?
It's very rarely sold off, mainly because in many of these projects, the big tail end benefit is at the later end of the project life cycle. So you don't want to sell too soon unless you get a real market value for it. And frankly, communities, if they're in, they tend to be in the long term, and they leverage being involved in one project to and being involved in another project. So we have seen very rarely community selling their interest in the project after 5 or 10 years.
Mhm. Thank you. Here's another one. If Indigenous groups see their equity ownership as a means to shape projects, what are the challenges in working with other equity providers who maybe are focused on financial returns? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
They like it because it reduces risk. So other equity providers like the idea that there's equity being held by Indigenous communities. If you happen to be Confed-Life or Manulife on the long-term debt side, if you have to be a private equity provider or a public institution equity provider, the fact that there's risk on the part of equity on the part of Indigenous communities means that you have a project that's more holistic. So we don't find a disconnect there. You have to negotiate it. It has to be fair terms, but there's no disconnect.
And I think to add to that, it helps move things through the regulatory process so that it can speed up the end result. And I think we've seen that in the community's relationships, for example, on the Kent to Chatham line, where things have moved quicker than expected. And that never happens in a construction project. So I think ensuring that there is that participation and there is a relationship built that communities have ownership in projects creates an expedited timeline, not necessarily in every project, but certainly helps to de-risk the timelines as it relates to that regulatory process.
Thank you. I wonder, maybe Patrick or Penny, this one maybe I'll throw it to you first, but it's relevant to all of you also. The changes coming in the North American energy market, given the recent presidential election, might change some of the hypotheses used to build clean energy business cases. Any reactions from utilities or Indigenous communities?
So from our perspective, we haven't, in terms of the change in the administration in the US, we haven't heard anything from our partner First Nations in terms of concern. That said, there's still, to me, it underscores the fact that Ontario is transforming. The grid is doubling. We need all hands on deck in terms of generation. And I don't think any of that is going to change. I think Indigenous communities are increasingly going to be part of those projects simply because this is a race to get energy where it needs to be in a way that is efficient and effective. And Hydro One's transmission right now is 90% green energy. So we don't generate, but we transmit.
Thanks. Patrick?
Yeah, I think, I think the market activities in the United States absolutely can be impactful. Supply chains come to mind, but I think consistent with what Penny just said, BC Hydro just announced a $36 billion capital plan, and that's just over the next 10 years. And the drivers to that are all endogenous. And so we feel that we're largely sort of insulated from the political uncertainties of the United States, at least in the near term. And that's, as Penny says, that's the grid is undergoing transformative change, and so I think it's imperative that First Nations and their allies really think hard about the opportunities that are on the table, because there are a lot of them. And BC Hydro is very open, as just like Hydro One, to explore ways to make sure that First Nations get in on the ground floor and stay all the way up to the penthouse of these opportunities. And so it's an exciting time, very exciting time in our industry.
Great.
I mean, I had also, there is another county US play here. The reality is that we have to integrate our electricity systems even more. And therefore, tribal communities in the United States and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities here have shared interests. And we are seeing more and more of that with ICE. So the fact that Mr. Trump is going to say things in the short term we think are largely irrelevant, we are going to electrify the economy. We will need more electrification. That electrification will be more and more connected between provinces and territories and between Canada and the US. That makes for a stronger grid. It makes for a more economic grid, and will get us to a net zero future faster.
Thank you. One last one that's pretty specific. Is there an Indigenous or NGO organization based or operating in Alberta that mediate First Nation commercial businesses towards facilitating major resource project development?
There is a First Nation working group with Indigenous Services Canada and Prairie Scan that is supported through the Strategic Partnership Initiative that is run through Indigenous Services Canada. So that would be one point of call. And they meet every few months. We have a rep on it. We support them. And that's the one that I'm aware of.
Great. And I guess I would say that, go ahead.
I would say too that the First Nations Major Projects Coalition has national representation. We are also divided into, our membership is divided into 4 areas, and one is within the prairie provinces. So very specific to a region, not specific necessarily to a province, but that we are extending our membership across the country. And I mean, I mentioned that we're 170 communities strong. We're looking to build that membership out and support regional development within that context.
Thank you so much. I was just going to throw it to you to say something on that. Great. Okay, we're going to wrap it up. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to throw it to each of you before we leave, just to give us the one thing you're kind of excited about in the next year in 2025 that you're working on that you think people should know about. And so, Saga, I'll throw it to you first, and I'll go across.
Thanks for that opportunity. I know Penny mentioned that we recently had lost a member of the FNMPC team, and I want to acknowledge that loss. But in the face of that, Neela would have wanted the successes of our organization to continue. And in that vein, we are holding an 8th annual conference in Toronto on April 27th to 29th. And it's a conference that the FNMPC hosts every year for the past 8 years. And this conference is focusing on valuing reconciliation in the global market space. So I think to your point earlier around US-Canada relations, we not only look at those affiliations, we look at Indigenous communities across the globe and bring in their perspectives and their successes. So really looking forward to the content of this conference, as well as some of the outcomes and the reports that will feed into the work that we do at the FNMPC.
Wonderful. Thank you. Patrick, really quickly, what are you looking forward to in 2025 at BC Hydro?
There's just a tremendous amount of activity. There's just no shortage of very exciting opportunities, and so I'm looking forward to continuing to be very, very active, working with First Nations. And I can't emphasize enough how important organizations like the Major Projects Coalition and ICE are, because they really help add to the capacity of First Nations to be able to handle sort of the fire hose of opportunities that they're forced to drink from. And it's a good news story, but there is a tremendous amount of work, and it's very complex work to do. And so organizations like FNMPC, ICE are very, very important, and we're very thankful that they are active in the space at the moment.
Great. Well, it's an easy throw to you then, Chris. What are you looking forward to from ICE's perspective in
Two
2025?
things. Let's bring it home. We got generation, but let's talk about the house. So we really want to amplify First Nations energy efficient housing. That's a $7 to $9 billion opportunity that can really reduce emissions and also reduce costs and improve health. That's one of our major focuses. We do think we need to redouble efforts on diesel reduction in northern and remote communities. We've gone some distance, but there's more distance to go. So those are two of the newer things we're emphasizing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Penny, Abel, last word goes to you today. What are you looking forward to in 2025?
Oh, so here's two things I'm looking forward to. The continued electrification of the North. Wataynikaneyap just celebrated an exceptional milestone, getting so many of the communities grid connected and continuing to do that. Here's the other thing I'm looking forward to. We have an opportunity here. I keep saying this. I want to say it again, doubling the grid within the next decade. I'm looking forward to seeing the pieces put in place where Indigenous communities are actually leading the construction side, and that's my personal excitement as a person who spent a lot of time building linear infrastructure. I think it's going to come faster than folks think, and I can't wait to see the first one.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for your frank assessments of progress today on this front. Congrats on all the great work you're doing. It's been a real honor to talk to you all today. And thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. Thanks for your excellent questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but love your interest in this topic. Please check out all the links in the chat. And don't forget to sign up for the Transition Accelerator Forum in June as well. Thanks to everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Yeah.